You've highlighted here at Mobile World Congress that you're worried about freedom of speech because of European regulations. Just spell out the case to us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great to be here. This is my first trip abroad since President Trump has made me chairman of the FCC. And one of the big focuses on this visit is AI. You come to these big conferences, 5G was the buzzword for many years, but now it's being replaced by AI. And what's important to the United States is that we continue to have the gold standard when it comes to AI technology. And part of that is to make sure these technologies develop free from ideological bias. And there's some concerns that the Trump administration has expressed and that I've expressed, and some of the approach that Europe is taking in particular with the DSA could end up imposing some form of censorship on the development of AI technology, and that'll make it harder for it to develop here in Europe.
The Digital Services Act is effectively about preventing illegal, harmful activities online, stopping disinformation. What is wrong with that principle?
Yeah, in theory, if it was limited to that, it would be pretty good. But the reality is there's a lot of mission creep from there, and it authorizes the government to put flaggers inside of different companies. The speech that it ends up regulating goes beyond the type of sort of conduct that we would all agree on, pedophilia, terrorist speech, and it moves beyond that, and that's what's concerning because it ends up being a race to the bottom. With technology, it's difficult to stop that type of regulation at the borders, and so I think it's bad for Europe as a general matter to have AI that's not based on a full diversity of viewpoint, but it's not acceptable to the United States if it ends up having extraterritorial application. There's another layer of concern for us, which is protectionism. To the extent that these regulations are really directed at US companies and US companies alone, and there's exceptions for companies based in Europe, that's not going to be acceptable. Because again, the US wants to lead in AI. We don't want to have to go about that alone. We're happy to partner with countries, and those that align with the US for a free and open AI are going to deliver the benefits for their people as well.
European lawmakers are worried about misinformation from Chinese and Russian bots. How do you stop that threat without changing the legislation?
Yeah, we think there's a lot of steps you can do that would empower individual users to take steps to block or to mute or to not follow that type of conduct. But the problem is when the government starts to dictate and micromanage what can be said on the internet, you end up sweeping in a lot of content that is really just sort of core political speech, religious speech, dissenting views on the scientific front. And in particular, when it comes to AI models, I think there is a concern in Europe that some of their companies are starting to fall behind, and in part, they make it very difficult to obtain data to train AI. And AI data is like a textbook for a student. If you have a book where every other page is ripped out, it's not going to be as good as a result. So we are really at a fork in the road right now. China is developing its AI. DeepSeek is an example. It's a very censored version of AI. If you ask DeepSeek what happened at Tiananmen Square, it tells you it doesn't know. If you ask about Uyghur genocide, it doesn't give you answers. So it's really the time for Europe and the US and Western allies to align on a free speech version of AI, and that's what the US is committed to.
I have heard a conversation here at Mobile World Congress where a senior European told me there are concerns that GDPR, this privacy legislation that Europe has been so proud of and hoping that other jurisdictions would adopt, that could limit the amount of data collected, therefore impacting the training of AI models. Do you think Europe has just shot itself in the foot with GDPR?
I think Europe does have some challenges here. As I go around this conference, there's a lot of people that believe that Europe is losing some speed in terms of its economic power, and it needs to adjust its regulations, and GDPR is part of that. Everybody believes in privacy, but Europe is making it exceptionally difficult to obtain the data that's necessary to train AI. That's already resulted in some problems for Europe where products are introduced in other parts of the globe much faster, much more quickly than it's done in Europe, but there's still time to correct course and make sure that Europe can ally with the US. We'll have gold standard AI, but we have to have access to that training data.
When you talk about a gold standard, the reality is the largest social media platform on the planet, Meta, has done away with the fact-checking, the content moderation. Some believe it starts to look a bit like the Wild West. Is it? Is there a risk of that?
No, not at all. I do think that we are returning in America to our free speech roots, to our tradition of First Amendment values, and we believe that everybody should have a voice. And what's happening is a lot of these companies are making decisions to re-empower individual users to make decisions. When you centralize control over speech on the internet, whether it's in the hands of a government or of a single corporation, you can make mistakes. And a lot of us are aware of the mistakes from speech they don't like, but there's also ideas that never flourish. And in America, what we're seeing is when you censor words, you're censoring ideas, and that slows down innovation. And right now, as we're returning to free speech in America, there's this feeling of a lifting of suppression across the country. I think it's going to help power economic growth as well.
It's a huge pendulum swing though, isn't it? From regulators regulating, to industry regulating, to consumers having to regulate. That is a huge swing from where we've come from.
Well, if you look back over the course of history, I think it's not. I think we long embraced that in the United States. I think the last 4 to 5 years, there was a departure from it. So I think this is a more returning to our roots. After all, when you go through COVID-19, there's an increase in government control. And when you have an increase in government control, ultimately that results in a suppression of speech. As we're coming out of the COVID-19 controls, I think it's great to see companies like Meta re-embracing the free speech tradition. Companies like X have long done that as well. And in America, we just want to make sure there's not a protectionist approach that ends up having difficulties in terms of the developing of AI, not just in Europe, but having consequences abroad. Because again, the key right now is we need to make sure that there's Western AI that develops quickly, appropriately, to compete with AI in China. Because at the end of the day, companies that are making AI in China, they're not going to necessarily follow the rules of the road. They're going to get access to this data one way or another, and we need some robust competition to that.
It's funny as you talk about controls and protectionism, it's that very landscape in the United States that has allowed DeepSeek to flourish. This Chinese technology got going because of the lack of access to very expensive US chips that there are export controls on some of this key product out of the US. The Chinese tried to do it on the cheap as a result. What is the threat of DeepSeek to big American tech players?
Well, look, there's certainly some concerns around DeepSeek. One is it looks pretty clear like they've distilled some data from OpenAI and other technologies. While they claim they did it on the cheap, they may have done it on the take instead. But the US is going to have the full stack, from the chip systems to the data centers to all of the scientists that we need to work on these technologies. So we're going to make sure the US leads the way. But I think a lot of DeepSeek technology has been developed, and they aren't being entirely truthful about either the funding or the sources of data that they've been using.
Distilling AI is something that everybody's now debating and looking at. What is the prospect that this continues by and large thanks to DeepSeek open source technology?
Well, look, the US again is committed to leading the way. You know, the last couple of years we took a potentially excessively regulatory approach, even in the US, with respect to AI. What we see from President Trump and his administration is a return to some common set of values at the FCC. We're not going to excessively regulate AI. We're going to make sure that the data centers are there to develop it, and we're going to lead the way. But again, we're not interested in necessarily doing that alone, and that's why here in Europe we're open. We want them to partner with us. We think it would be great for Europe. We think it would be great for America. But if you step back, again, the biggest threat right now, AI is the future technology. There's a fork in the road. China's investing. And in the US, we want to make sure that we have something with Western values that competes with it. And there's just some concerns that with the DSA and the GDPR, some excessive regulation there could be holding things back.
Not regulating is one thing, and we can see how positive that is for business when regulation is rolled back. But what about the big arm of the Chinese state? We're already seeing deep investments from the likes of Huawei. How competitive can Western companies truly be against a state machine that has so many resources? Yeah,
Huawei continues to be a big concern. In the US, we've taken a lot of concerted action. We have ripped a lot of the Huawei gear out of our networks. We prohibit it from going back in the networks. My first meeting as FCC chair, we took action that will provide funding for that process. You walk around this conference here, it's a little concerning how large the Huawei footprint is and their booth is, and so we need to continue to take action there, because ultimately security of the network is fundamentally more complex and important as we move to AI. Whatever concerns you had about Huawei gear in a 4G network or a 5G network, when it gets embedded in the AI, it's a much more serious concern. I do think that countries around the world need to take this seriously.
Germany's not, and there was a pushback from Deutsche Telekom this week about what Huawei product you can put into the infrastructure, saying, look, an antenna, is that sensitive? And they think not. The core, yes, it's been taken up, but in other areas where the product is cheap, they think they should be allowed to use that. Do you agree with that? Is it a blanket ban on Huawei that you're seeking?
Yeah, that's our approach in the US. It's just simply insecure gear. It may be cheap, but ultimately in the long run, the cost is too high. And I do think if you look at the spend that DT is doing, it is coming down a little bit with respect to Huawei. I think that's a good thing. There's probably some more room for growth there. But I think every country has to make its own decision. The US has led the way. We are worried about Huawei. We're going to continue to take that approach. And we're going to look for other countries that are willing to partner with us on that.
I want to just tackle the relationship between the US and Europe, because you've made some friendly remarks here, but the reality is the White House has taken issue with some of the fines and taxes lobbed on big US technology. And the latest that is under investigation is Google and its practices of favoring its own vertical search. What is wrong with Europe tackling what it sees as monopolistic behavior?
Yeah. In the US, we are very concerned as well about competition and making sure that there's a level playing field. The issue when it comes to European regulation is to make sure that it's being driven by those considerations and not by a protectionist agenda. Because if a company is being attacked by Europe simply because it originated or is based in America, that's not something that we're going to be interested in accepting. And so you'll see us speaking up. But to your point, there's a tremendous opportunity to work together. We're going to lead the world when it comes to AI and next generation technologies. We don't have to do it alone. We can do it in a way that will benefit Europe as well. I think we're all better off if we do that.
The protectionist push that you're talking about, a lot of this is stemming from the United States, and we've just even seen in recent hours that there is a tariff warfare now that's transpired. The United States with Canada, Mexico, China, retaliatory tariffs. Are those US tech services revenues a sitting duck? Because Europe is also looking at ways to arm itself if tariffs are coming this way.
Well, look, what we're ultimately looking for in the United States is fair and equal treatment for U.S. companies and U.S. businesses, and the Trump administration itself is working hard on these issues, and I'm confident that President Trump and his team is going to land this in a spot that works out well for U.S. interests, which is what they're looking out for.
So if Europe went after those US tech companies with tariffs or some sort of tax, some fresh legislation, how would you feel about that?
If what?
If Europe went after some big US tech companies with fresh taxes, legislation, some sort of a retaliatory response to tariffs, is there anything you can do?
Well, this is a broader debate about tariff that sort of goes outside of the FCC itself, but the U.S. trade representatives have been very clear about what they're willing to accept. They're very clear about the fact that they won't, sit idly by if there's protectionist conduct taking place with respect to U.S. businesses, but with respect to exactly where things are with the tariffs, I would refer to the administration itself.
In the first Trump administration, the president took issue with the domestic supplier radio networks, effectively that there wasn't one in the States, and saying that, look, perhaps there should be an idea to take a controlling stake in Nokia or Ericsson, maybe both. Is that going to be a feature that's revived during this administration?
Well, I'll defer to President Trump on the path forward on that. What I'll say, to your point, looking backwards, is there was a lot of concern by companies and countries, really, that wanted options and choices beyond Huawei, but they felt like they didn't have one. Nokia and Ericsson have been two of the main ones they've been doing. They've been working hard. One thing that we've done in the U.S. is we've invested a lot in something called Open RAN, which is a way to sort of replicate a lot of that Huawei gear, but by doing it through software, where a lot of Western companies are very successful. And a lot of that O-RAN technology, that software technology that can compete with Huawei gear is actually maturing right now, and we're pretty excited about that future.
So that open source technology mitigates the need to have your own domestic radio supplier.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're always interested in reshoring. We're always interested in reinvigorating America's manufacturing base. But with respect to this particular issue, software can help give us an edge to compete against their hardware.
Let me ask you about DEI, because there is a particular investigation that is interesting to us. The parent company of CNBC is NBC Universal and Comcast. You've taken issue over the company's corporate diversity initiatives. What is the issue that you have with the company and those policies? And do you intend to pick your way through every company, or is this sending a message by going after one of the largest media companies?
Yeah, when President Trump came in, one of the first things he did, I think it was on this first day that he was sworn in, he signed an executive order to end DEI. And at the FCC, we moved quickly on that. I've now ended the FCC's own promotion of DEI. I mean, you'd be shocked at how many millions of dollars the FCC itself was spending on DEI. And we're also looking at the entities that we regulate as well to make sure they're not engaging in DEI, which at the end of the day is discriminating against people based on race. We have our own rules at the FCC, Equal Employment Opportunity, EEO rules. I started with Comcast because they're a company, that, as you noted, that does business in a lot of different sectors, from broadcast to cable to internet itself. But ultimately, any business that is regulated by the FCC, I would encourage them to end their DEI practices. And if there's a company that doesn't know that they should end their DEI practices, they're free to reach out to my office, and I will send them a letter to let them know that that's what we expect.
Just finally, there's a lot of geopolitics at the moment, whether there's a peace agreement with Ukraine, but the reality is we're operating in a heightened geopolitical environment. What is your approach to critical infrastructure in the United States and evaluating whether those assets are strategically important, therefore need a certain level of funding?
Yeah, so we're engaged in a lot of debates in the U.S. right now on this. We have a system called the Universal Service Fund. It's a $9 billion a year fund that supports rural internet builds as well as subsidizing internet connections for low-income Americans. There's been some concerns that have been raised about the mechanism that we use to fund that, and we're looking at that. We also have a $42 billion funding initiative at the Commerce Department that ended up not going very far during the last administration that Secretary Lutnick is going to be taking a look at. And so we need to make sure that that critical infrastructure of the internet continues to function, has the support that it needs. But we're excited about a lot of technologies right now. You look at this latest generation of low Earth orbit satellites, Starlink being an example. We're really excited at the FCC about the ability to take direct to cell connectivity. So instead of going from your handset to a local tower, you can go right from your handset to a low Earth orbit satellite, effectively eliminating dead zones. We're really interested in that technology, and we should be taking steps soon at the FCC to help give it another boost and be more powerful and reach more people.
Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, enjoyed it, thanks.